Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. This is the next video in the additional skill RPA developer series where we are looking at what exactly are the additional skill as an RPA developer I can have to perform good in the automations. And the topic which we have chosen is the databases. In the prior videos of the playlist, we have already covered how do you install the SQL server. So in case you don't have the SQL server at all, you can watch the first video in the playlist and get the SQL server. Also, we have covered the basics of databases, tables, functions, clauses, and now we are exploring the constraints. When we talk about the constraints, we have a lot of constraints which are available. We have already covered some of them in the previous videos. So in case if you are coming to the channel for the first time and you haven't watched the previous videos, please watch the previous videos on constraint on SQL Server to get the context of this video. Also, in case you are coming for the first time and you haven't already subscribed, please consider subscribing to the channel to get the latest updates. Talking of the agenda, we are going to start by having a quick recap of what exactly are constraint, a recap of primary, foreign, unique and check, which we have already covered. Today in this video, we are going to explore what exactly is a default constraint, how do you use it, when exactly it is beneficial, how do you add it to an existing table, what are the varieties of default constraints which are available, benefits, and all of this we are going to see with the help of step-by-step demonstration. Okay, having said that, let's get started with the first one, which is called the constraints, right? So constraint in SQL Server simply means the rules and the conditions which are defined on a table to make sure that the data which is getting inserted into the table follows some criteria, it follows some rules, it follows some regulations, right? So in case if you are creating a databases and you are inserting the data into it and you want to make sure that your data is accurate, consistent and reliable, we use something which is called constraints. Okay, so here are the common constraints which you are looking on the screen: primary, foreign, unique, check, default and not null. All of them has a different meaning and a different significance, right? Primary we have already covered in the previous video. Just a quick recap: whenever I want to make sure that a particular row in a table is not duplicate and it has no null value, I can always use something which is called primary key, right? How do you create primary key? You just use the create table statement, and here as you can see you just mention primary key, and this makes sure that the employee ID becomes the primary key, meaning when you are inserting the data into the table, employee ID would not be duplicate and it would not be null. Okay, the second constraint which we have explored in the previous video was the foreign key, where if I want to make a relationship between two tables, which simply means that if I am inserting a data into the employee table, I have to make sure that the employee belong to some department, right? HR, IT, finance or anything. If there is an employee which is having no department, then it does not make sense, right? You can build any kind of relationship. Let's say you are building a student database. So student should be a part of some class 1, class 2, class 3, class 4. That kind of relationship is done with the help of foreign key, right? This also we have explored. The third one we have explored is the unique key, which simply means that how do you make sure uniqueness of the value within one or more columns. It's not only restricted to one column like primary key, right? One or more column, meaning that employee ID and email ID. So the combination of employee ID and email ID cannot be duplicate. So such constraints we have seen that can be done with the unique one. And recently we have explored something which was called the check constraint, which allow you to have a check while inserting the data into the database. With check constraint we can simply define an expression that okay, I want to insert the data only when this condition is satisfied. So if you see the syntax here, in this employee table, this is the primary key, check is a constraint which would only allow to insert the data into the record if the age is greater than 18. If the age is less than 18, it won't allow you to insert, right? So all of this we have already seen. That was just to give you a quick recap. If you have any doubts in any of these, please watch the previous video. The link is available in the description. Okay. Today we are going to see what exactly is our default constraint, right? So whenever I talk about a default constraint, as the name suggests, default is something when you want to have a default value for a column. So for example, I am creating a database and I want to make sure that the default value is no, right? Or I am creating a database for my country is India. I want to make sure that if anybody forgot to provide that value, let's do and put it as India, right? So that means that if you have any column in the database where you want to have some default value, we can use something which is called default constraint. Default constraint in SSMS provides a convenient way to ensure that the column has a predefined value with no explicit value specified in the insert operation, which means that in case you forgot to put the value in the insert, then also this column will have the default value. Okay, how does it look like and how we can specify that? Let's see that with an example directly in the SQL Server, right? So I'm going back to my SQL Server now. This is our SQL Server. I am connected to my database. Let's go to this UI database and I'll say new query. Okay, so now in here I don't have any table, so let's try to create a table with default constraint. Okay, so I'm going to copy paste a query here like this. Okay, now what is happening here? We are instructing SQL Server to create a table whose name is employee. Employee ID is a primary key. I hope that you understand now. We have first name, last name, age, hire date, salary, right? All of these are self-explanatory that we want to have this column, right? But I want to have one more column which is called is active. When I say is active, it means that it is a column. Its value would be bit, right? That means that it can have 0 or it can have 1. However, I have written something here which is called default and I have written 1. Now 1 means the employee is active. Whenever I am creating a record in the employee table, I want to make sure that this column is set to 1, right? You always can set it to 0 after writing some query. But let's say whenever you are inserting the data and that time you forgot to specify this value, then this column would make sure that it get a default value of 1. So this is how you specify the default, right? So in case you want to default for age, you can just put a space here, write it here default, right? FAULT and 21. So in case anybody forgot to provide an age, the age would be defaulted to 21, right? It's absolutely simple. Just use the keyword which is called default and provide the value. Okay. So let's go here and say execute. Command is completed successfully and the table is created now. Okay, I'll scroll down. So we have created a constraint which is called isActive, right? So now let's try to insert into the table. Okay, so let me quickly show you first what exactly we have in the table. So I'll just go here and I say select star from employees, right? That is the table we just created and I don't have any record, right? Now I am telling SQL Server to insert into the employees, right? See here, employee ID, first name, last name, age. Just close this. Okay, so we have employee ID, employee name, first name, last name, age, hire date and salary. But isActive is a column in the table and I am not inserting that in the insert. See, isActive is not mentioned here. If I execute this here and I say execute, one row is affected. I'll go here and I say execute and you can see that isActive is getting a default value of 1. Why it is getting a default value of 1? Because we have specified here isActive should be getting a default value of 1. However, let's say I want to insert a new record. Okay, so instead of John, let me make it to Mukesh. I would say Mukeshkala, age 30, and if I provide here is active. Okay, now here I am telling SQL Server to explicitly give the value of is active to 0. Now if I go and execute this, okay, so it says that you have violated the primary key, so I cannot have a duplicate primary key, right? Primary key constraint. Execute it again. One row affected. I'll go here and execute, and you can see that the value is 0, right? So the concept is simple, right? In case somebody forgot or did not specify is active, I wanted to make sure that the value is set to 1. But you have an option to always give the new value whatever you require, right? So this is how you work on the default constraint. The syntax is simple. Whatever column you want to have, just mention bit default and specify it to 1. Okay. Coming back to the presentation, this is where our table, this is how you create, and this is the same example which we have seen where we didn't mention the isActive column and it was by default set to 1 because we had the default value set to 1. Okay, let's move forward. Now in here what I did is my table was already created, right? My table was not there, my table was not there, and we created a fresh table employee. So I could actually add it directly here in the default constraint. Now I may be in a situation, right, where my table is already created, but I want to add a default constraint. So can I modify my existing table? The answer is yes, guys. Remember we talk about the alter table statement. So you can add constraint to existing table as well. How you can do that? Alter table employees, which means that alter the table whose name is employee, then you simply mention alter the column, which is the column name is active, and set default to 0. That's it, right? This statement will update the default value for the is active column to 0, representing that it's an inactive status, right? So we can add the constraint to existing tables as well. Okay, what I want you guys to do is just go and try this on your SQL Server to get more clarity. So this thing I'll leave it you guys for your implementation. I want you guys to try it, and once you try it, let me know in the comments that yes, you have tried this alter statement. Okay, I'll wait for your comment and let's move forward. Now whenever we talk about the default constraint, right, so as of now I just show you that I only have got this one which is called employee, and I mentioned is that is active as 1 or 0. Now you might be thinking that it is always like 1 0 yes no, but the answer is no. You can have varieties of default constraint. These are some of the example. Okay, let me quickly go one by one. The first one is a constant default value, right? I can have a default constraint which is having a default value, such as this one is active bit default is equal to 1, which we just saw. If you go to the second one, which is called a function default value, which is a other variation of the default constraint, where we can use a function to calculate and assign value to a column, right? Which means that you can actually use functions to evaluate the value and then set it as a default value, right? To give you an example, see here, create the table orders. Order ID is a primary key, right? Total amount is a decimal where we are storing the order total. However, if you see the order date, this is nothing but the date. So I am using the date time function because I want to store the date. So this is the date time data type, right? Default value. And now what is this get date? So get date is a function to get the current date. Okay, so if I just try to execute this statement in the SQL, what would happen? Whenever you are inserting any record in the order table, this order date will have a value of the current system date and time. So that means that here the get date is a function. How does it work? Let me quickly show in the SQL. So this is my same statement. I want to create an order table. This is a function select get date. So if I just copy this, let me quickly show you one interesting thing. If I just say select and I mention get date, I execute, it should get the current system date and time, right? So let's say I want to create a table where I want to default this value with the current system date and time. So I simply use this default and get date time. This is a function. I'll execute this. Table is created successfully. Now let's say insert. How do you insert? Insert into orders, right? And I just mentioned the column name, which is, sorry, my bad, order ID, comma, total amount, right? I am not giving the order date, right? So, and then I'll mention the keyword as values, and then I'll give the value. So order ID is an integer, so I'll give as 1, and the total amount, let me give it to 5,000. Simple insert statement, execute, completed. Let's quickly see what we have in the table. So I'll say select star from orders. Let's execute, and you would notice that the order ID is 1, total amount is 5,000. However, I automatically get the order date, right? Because I want it to store the current system date and time whenever it is executing, right? So no need to write specific I would say queries, specific code to insert the data into the tables, right? You can always use this function, which is called the default. So that was the default function, right? Function default value. What else you can do? Sequence default value, right? If you have a sequence of object defined in a database, you can use it to generate a default value, right? So what I have done here is I have a sequence which start with 1000 and it increment by 1, right? We haven't explored the sequence, but as of now you can understand that you can store the sequence in the database as well. Okay, so let's say I have started a sequence which is starting from 1000 increment by 1. Now what this function will do is it will have a sequence in the database which would start from 1000, 1001, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can increment it by 10, 20, 30. So it would be like 1010, 1020, 1030. Now if I am creating a table and I want to make sure that the order ID is coming from this sequence, 1000, 1001, 1002, right? I do not want it to have the random number like 1, 2, 3, 4. I only wanted to have the order ID from this sequence, right? 1010, 1020, 30. That is also possible with default constraint. So create table orders. Order ID is a primary key. This we have already seen. Here I am mentioning the default keyword, which means that this value is going to be the default value even if you don't put it. But where is the default value? The default value I want to get it from this sequence. So I say here next and say value for order sequence. This is the order sequence which we have created, and that's it. Now this statement would make sure that whenever you are creating a primary key in the order ID, it won't be automatically generated. You can get it from your own sequence, right? So that is meaning sequence default value, right? I want you guys to try it. Just go to your SQL server, execute this statement first, and then execute this statement, and then try to insert some record. You will get a clear idea on this, right? But the idea here is that the default constraint is not only restricted to a single value, right? You can have functions, you can have SQL defined value, you can have constant default value as well. Okay. So that was just to give you a variety of default constraint. There are other default constraint as well, which you will come across as we continue in this learning journey. Okay, so as of now, you just have to remember that we have all these variety of default constraints which are available. Moving forward now, how do you remove the default constraint, right? So I have already created a table. The table is having a default constraint, right? But after some days, I have a business requirement that I want to remove the default constraint. Can I do that? The answer is yes, right? Same like to add the default constraint, I was using the alter table employees. I altered the column and add a column. Now here, to remove that, I have to again alter the table. So this is the query, guys. Alter table employees, alter column IsActive, and drop the default, right? Remember, when I have to add it, I was using alter table employees. This was same. Alter column, this was also the same. IsActive is the column name, and to add the constraint, I say set default to 0. Same way, till this point is same, right? Now here, instead of set, I am using the drop and then default. So this would make sure that the default constraint is removed from the IsActive column. Okay, now in this example, as you can see that we have removed the default constraint. Now once this is executed, this column would be removed and the subsequent operation will have no longer the default value, right? It is not going to impact the existing values in the table. Whenever you remove the default constraint and you try to insert new values in the column, this will not be functional because obviously you have removed it, right? But that will happen from the subsequent insert statement. Please note that when you remove the drop constraint, it does not change the existing value. It only affects the future insert statement. The existing data remains as it is. Okay, I want you guys to take a pause this video here and just read through the points whichever I have mentioned here, so that it is clear to you in terms of theory. Okay, so I would leave this screen for you guys to read for a moment. Okay, so I hope you have paused the video and read the default constraint. Moving ahead, what exactly are the benefits which I get when I apply the default constraint, right? The first one is the data consistency. Default constraint ensured that the predefined value is automatically assigned to the column where no explicit value is defined, which means that in case I am getting data from multiple sources, my data would be always consistent in terms of that column value being populated. Simplified data entry, right? It makes sure that the data entry is reduced. So let's say you have got 10, 15, 20 columns where you want to have the default value, right? No need to have that column in the insert statement. So with the default constraint in picture, I can actually omit that column from the insert statement and the default value would be automatically assigned. Okay, the third point here in the slides shows about the data integrity, right? Which means that it provides insertion of the null value to the column. Let's say you have a column which is a null value column which can allow null, and somebody forgot to insert that value into the insert statement. Now what would happen? Your database will have a value of null. One way is obviously to have the column as not null, but however you can always apply a default constraint to make sure that you have the data integrated. Okay, database flexibility, it allows the database to have a flexible design, which means that you can have default value that analyze with the business rule and the common scenarios, right? For example, whenever I am creating a flag, right, so the flag status has to be set to false by default, right? So all the flags whichever are coming to the databases can be set to false. I can have the timestamp, right, that whenever I am updating any record or whenever I am inserting any record, I want to make sure that the current system date and time is captured. So I can use the functions. I can use calculated values, which in turn simplifies the data model. Okay, and the last one is the performance optimization. Default constraint can also contribute to the performance optimization by reducing the complexity and the number of queries required to insert the data, right? The less number of fields in the insert query, the more would be the performance, right? With the default value automatically assigned, the application code can focus on providing the explicit values for specific scenarios rather than duplicating the default values repetitively, right? Increasing your performance. So these are all the benefits which you get when I implement the default constraint in the databases. Please take a moment and go through all of them once again. Okay, so with that, we have come to the end of the presentation. Let's have a quick recap, right? So today we have seen that in SQL Server, we have a lot of constraints which are available. One of the constraint is the default constraint, which allow you to have a default value in a column, right? If we do not provide any value, the default value is assigned. It has a various benefit, data consistency, performance, a lot of benefits which we have already discussed, right? There are a variety of default constraint to use. You can use functions, you can have static values, you can have calculated values, and we have also seen that we can always alter the table, we can add or remove the default constraints. Okay, so with this, I would like to wrap this video here. If you have any more questions, any more doubts, feel free to write me in the comments, or you can also drop me an email as well. So thank you for watching. If you like this video, please do subscribe to the channel, and happy automation.